we were there for the companionship and the good talk. And then we moved to the Capitol skyline, which was also an interesting kind of a, it was designed by Morris Lapidus, who did most of the strip in Miami Beach, like the Deauville and the Eden Rock and everything. I think this may have been one of his lesser efforts at the Capitol skyline. But so we adjusted to that variation. And then, of course, came the great change, which everyone here, I'm very happy to see, looks hale and hearty, and we see, hopefully we'll soon be on the other side of that hill. And as you know from past experience and past talks, that the board decided to go ahead, and we were very fortunate, as I say, to get this beautiful venue. DuPont Circle has more history than I could possibly have imagined. I just recently discovered that right next door, where the DuPont's, I can believe it's the Hotel DuPont Circle, Rick, is that what it's called now? The Hotel DuPont. On that site was a house that was built by Levi Leiter, who was the president of Marshall Field of happy memory, one of the great department stores of America. And in that period, when Washington had a brief vogue for about 30 years as a fashion, a place to be, an event, a location, most of the great mansions that we see today were built during that period before income tax. And Levi Leiter built that house and moved into it with his family. And the interesting part that I'm just going to share with you today briefly, he had his family was raised there, and one of his daughters was Mary Leiter. Mary was beautiful and accomplished, and a lovely woman, young woman. She was presented at court in London. Of course, all the plutocrats would go to Britain to hobnob with the British aristocracy. She was presented at court, and she caught the eye of, I believe it was Arthur Curzon, who was an up-and-coming young British politician. They were married in 1895 here at St. John's on Lafayette Square. And she went on to join him in his political life. He was later chosen to be Viceroy of India, and she went out to India with him, and she had the rather grand title of Vicereine of India. So a good Washington girl from right down the corner here, around the corner here, spent her life as the Vicereine of India. Another interesting fact that we know of. I'm going to just mention a couple of, first of all, I will entertain a motion to dispense with the reading of the minutes for the last meeting. May I have a motion, please? So moved. And I have a second. So, second. And I'm informed by our treasurer that things are pretty much status quo ante, so I will also entertain a motion to dispense with the reading of the treasurer's report. May I have a motion on that, please? Second? All in favor? Aye. Okay. Now, next on our agenda of business, before we proceed to our speaker today, Mary Belcher, who's right here in front of me. Thank you for coming, Mary. We are going to present to the members a candidate for the vacant position of on the board of directors of the association. And the person who we are proposing for your approval is John Edwards, who's a registered architect in this city. His practice is close by here in the DuPont Circle area. He is a sixth generation Washingtonian. Would you like to establish your bona fides in a few words to the members before we consider your election?
Thank you. Does this work? Okay. Just found out recently that my great-grandfather was also a board member of AOI about 100 years ago in the 1920s. So this is quite literally, the AOI is in my blood. So I'm happy to be here, and as as was said, I'm a partner at a firm, architecture firm here on 14th Street that's been established here since 2000, so around 21, going on 22 years now here, and have lived on Capitol Hill since I graduated from college way back in the 1980s. So happy to be here, and hopefully we'll be happy to serve all of you on the board.
Please.
What is your favorite building in Washington?
Washington Cathedral is by far my favorite.
He had a good answer ready. There's so many to choose from. So having introduced John to all of you, I'd like to ask for a vote of the membership to elect John Edwards as a member of the Board of Directors, as we say, without portfolio, a regular member as opposed to an officer. So may I have a show of hands and ayes? All in favor? Aye. The ayes appear to have it. John, you don't know what you're in for, but welcome aboard. Okay. Oh, we have the Zoom. Other way. Well, we have 100% in favor of John. They could sell that software to the Soviet Union. Now, Nelson, you have a few items for us today. Nelson is our historian. He and I worked together in the early 70s at the Congressional Research Service, and have been great friends, he and Lisa and I, ever since.
We have steps.
There are steps.
I'm glad of that. Oh, boy. Do I need steps? Well, a great tradition of AOI is the trivia question. Not that it's a trivial matter, but the question is trivial. We've given it that title. Our question today, and it goes, a nice prize comes with it. We only, if you've won this in the last 25 years, you're disqualified. Please. We want to get some new people winning this. The question is, in 1977, an elected member of the new council of the District of Columbia under Home Rule was almost assassinated. He took a bullet to the chest, was taken to the hospital, and no, not yet, not yet. That's but survived. The doctor said that he it came very close to his heart, but he did miss his heart and didn't hit any vital organs. Now, the actual question is, what was the group, the name of the group that tried to assassinate this member of the council?
The Proud Boys.
That's a good one. That would happen today for sure. Maybe it will yet. Oh, no. Okay, who had their first hand up? Anybody? Over here, this lady. What did she say? Yeah, okay. Yeah, Hanafi, yeah, right. Yeah. Marion Barry, yes. The future mayor. Okay, she got it, right? Okay, okay, okay. Okay.
Nelson, where did you get copies of? Show us some of the goodies here.
Okay. Well, everybody gets at least one can of Senate beer. Down the street here is the Hyrick Mansion. They're now putting out Senate beer again. And if you buy it, a couple of pennies of each can goes to the continued preservation of the old Hyrick Mansion. So please purchase Senate beer, and it's very good. Very good. And what else do we have here? We have a no vote, no tax shirt. You know, Eleanor wants to get us statehood. I want us to be exempt from taxation, like Puerto Rico and the territory. You get a shirt. And for the late Joe Grano, we have a picture of him lecturing Obama. President Obama at the White House. And some cards that he put out from Rhodes Tavern where their first city election was held. And it almost was burned down by the British in 1814. But a lady came out and said, I am the charwoman, and a very poor family lives here. Don't burn this house down. And the British bought it and didn't burn it down.
I'm going to study from now on.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Nelson. And it's probably worth noting that the organization that Marion Barry was attending a meeting at was that was an assault on the building that's now the Human Rights Campaign Fund, but was built for, was it the American Jewish Congress? B'nai B'rith. One of the early examples of modern commercial architecture in downtown Washington, D.C. And the building is still there at 15th and M. 15th in Rhode Island. So 17th in Rhode Island, excuse me. So worth a look if you have an architectural sensitivity. So thank you all. Thank Nelson for that. And I saw he had a copy of Our American Government, which was produced in my office, the Congressional Research Service. Used to be made available by tens of thousands by members of Congress. They've become very scarce. So Nelson must have a good source of supply. In any event, I'd like now to turn to our speaker and the topic that we are looking at today, that we're hearing about today. And Mary Belcher is our guest speaker today. And she has worked on this issue for how many years, Mary? 17 years. It seems surprising that a city that is, in the world sense, as new as Washington is, could lose track of something as substantial as a cemetery in which thousands of people are buried. But it has happened, and it happened at the location now known as Walter Pierce Park in Adams Morgan, the backside of Adams Morgan, kind of the sloping down into the park on the east edge of the park. Mary has been a reporter. She has worked for the special prosecutor in the Iran-Contra affair. She has also been a teacher and has long reputation as being an activist, a community activist. And the Walter Pierce Park was in 2005. The district announced plans for substantial construction on that site, I understand. And in the past 17 years, Mary and her group have worked to save it. 8,400 people, it's 8,400 people are buried there. Most of them, I believe, were probably enslaved African Americans and Quakers as well, but she'll tell you more about that. The Colored Union Benevolent Association had established the cemetery. It was the Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery, and the association was an early supporter of schools for people of color, churches, social organizations, and ties to the Underground Railroad. And they were instrumental, apparently, in helping the escape of 77 enslaved people aboard the schooner Pearl in 1848. So, without further ado, as they say, Mary, would you please come up?
I'm not as entertaining as Tom and Nelson, and I don't have any prizes. But I hope I have some interesting. Hi, I want to thank you for inviting me to speak about Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery at Walter Pierce Park. It's about a mile up 19th Street from here, just south of the National Zoo grounds. A grassroots group of people have been working since 2005 to protect this African American cemetery site, which, as Tom told you, includes a smaller Quaker burial ground. And we were lucky to have the very early support of AOI. It was important to us financially, and especially for our morale. And that was long before we knew exactly what we were dealing with. So today I'll tell you about the men who founded Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery, and then about the cemetery itself. And in the last part of my talk, I'll describe the archaeological work at Walter Pierce Park. So the first slide shows you a date. In the autumn of 1838, you might already know, the Jesuit fathers of Georgetown College were preparing to sell 272 enslaved men, women, and children to plantations in Louisiana. In the local papers, no fewer than 4 separate slave dealers were advertising to buy likely Negroes at high prices. And racial violence erupted in our city throughout the 1830s. But Washington's African American community was also organizing at this time. They were opening schools, they were founding churches, and they were essentially creating alternative support systems that the white power structure had failed to provide. Under the city's Black Code, which was a set of oppressive laws affecting both free and enslaved Black members of our community, African Americans were prohibited from gathering for anything other than religious purposes. But in defiance of that law, a group of young men met on October 3rd, 1838, probably in a downtown Homer church, and they founded the Young Men's Benevolent Association. If we can have the next slide. This is their preamble. Whereas experience has proved that the association of individuals in the formation of societies for the express purpose of benevolence have seldom, if ever, failed to meet the sanction of both God and man, we therefore do unite and form ourselves together as one body for the mutual benefit of each other. And then if we go to the next slide, this is what you have on one side of your handout. Look for the side that shows you 4 columns. Oh, 3. I'm sorry. I changed the formatting. So over 6 decades, more than 70 men came and went through the association. It wasn't the first or only group of its kind. Mutual aid societies proliferated up and down the East Coast. But the free young men give us a chance to see how these groups operated in early Washington. So just while you look at the members list, I'll tell you what they did for each other. They provided death benefits, sick pay, job opportunities, and loans with interest. Failure to pay dues or repay loans were causes for expulsion. Many members were related by birth or marriage. If you look at that list, you'll see a lot of common surnames. You won't necessarily be able to figure out the in-laws. Some were among the first generation of children born in this city, and I guess you could call them Washington's original oldest inhabitants. The first criterion for membership was that a man be free. Some were born free, some were born enslaved. They met at Asbury Methodist Chapel at 11th and K Streets Northwest the first Wednesday of every month. And even though they met at a Methodist church, they were multi-denominational. Many were neighbors living near McPherson Square, Mount Vernon Square, the West End, and Georgetown. There was an initiation fee of $25, which you could pay $10 up front, and then there were monthly dues of 25 cents. And members agreed to maintain high moral standards. No personalities were allowed in debates. They didn't wear regalia, as far as I know. For funerals, they wore black suits, gloves, and crepe on their left arm. Meeting discussions were absolutely secret. You had to agree to that. Another quality many members shared was proximity to power. And I think we have a slightly powerful person there, my personal hero. Again, looking at that members list, the Freemans and the Shorters are on there, and they were related by marriage. And this, again, is about their proximity to power. They'd worked in the Jefferson and Madison White Houses, and they had cousins, aunts, and uncles at Monticello. Two other members, Henry Pleasance and Charles H. Brown, were bought out of slavery by Daniel Webster. And he would do this and expect people to repay him by working in his household at a reduced rate. And then to get to John Quincy here, just a few days before this portrait was taken in March 1843, he gave a young man named Isaac Clark money to help him buy his freedom. That same year, Clark joined the association, having collected enough to free himself from his enslaver, and Adams' in-law, Walter Helen. And just a spoiler alert, John Quincy Adams will appear again in this talk. So, in their day jobs, they were government messengers, waiters, coachmen, and laborers. And it's what they did in their off hours that made a lasting impact on our city. So if you flip your members list over, you'll see what's on this next slide. So you can see these guys were really busy. When was the last time you founded a church?
Today.
Okay, somebody said today. All right, good luck. But these churches, many of these churches exist today, in fact, which is amazing. And don't let the title Sunday school teacher or superintendent fool you. These were very powerful engines in the churches, and they often led to the rise of new churches. This was a way for African Americans to attend school when white schools weren't available. And the men of the association joined other fraternal groups, and they did things like send their daughters to Myrtilla Miners School for Girls just over at DuPont Circle. And I want to add here that it wasn't just men who founded churches and schools. Wives and daughters did too, but the association I'm talking about today was made up of men, so I'm going to stick to their gender here. White enslavers were right about one thing. They were right that black organizing posed a real threat to the institution of slavery. The Free Young Men's Benevolent Association was far more than a burial society. Its members undertook overt and covert actions to free enslaved people. And interesting, some of them, even before they formed the association, they'd been raising money to free enslaved people. They'd been speaking in oratory contests since they were teenagers, espousing anti-slavery doctrine, raising money under the tutelage of their slightly older friend, John F. Cook. Some hosted public parties to raise money. But in 1848, association members became part of the largest known Underground Railroad operation in history, the escape of 77 enslaved individuals on the schooner Pearl. So if we can go to the next page. I don't know if you can see this map very well, but it shows you, number one is here in southwest Washington. The boat was to go down here and then up to Frenchtown, Maryland. And for the 77 passengers on board and the crew, it didn't end well. The schooner got waylaid at the mouth of the Potomac, and it was here that armed enslavers seized the ship and towed them back to Washington. The crew was imprisoned, and many of the passengers were taken south to be sold, including six adult brothers and sisters of the Edmondson family. So if we can go to the next slide. These are association members who had ties, known ties to the Pearl, although I'm of the mind that they all knew about it. They all knew it was going to happen. This was a very close-knit group of people. There were several Edmondson in-laws who were members. One member who was implicated but not charged was a man named William Bush, who was a coachman who, with his wife Lucinda, was suspected of having transported passengers to the boat in Southwest. Bush's membership in the association is really intriguing because he was initiated into the group in early April 1848, right before the Pearl escape. And soon after, he left and moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he was one of the most active Underground Railroad conductors in a very active Underground Railroad town. So Bush is one of those things I'd love to know more about. I just don't. Freedom seeking was expensive. If an enslaver agreed to free you for a price, say $500, that's about $16,000 in today's money. And if you couldn't negotiate a price for your freedom, there was the Underground Railroad, but it required money too for lodgings, travel, and resettlement. And if an escape failed, as the Pearl did, there were legal costs. So in 1849, the time was ripe for this association to start looking for income outside of its membership fees. It may have been also that about this time, 11 years into their history, they had accumulated enough money among them to buy a cemetery. So this was the first cemetery. It was in square 272 between 12th, 13th V and W streets. They bought the entire square 272, which was next to a couple of other cemeteries, for $500. And this was called the Free Young Men's Burial Ground. It operated through 2 decades. In March of 1865, the Free Young Men changed their name to the Colored Union Benevolent Association, and they also received an official congressional charter. So if we can go to slide 10, this is a picture of Lincoln's funeral procession. And at the end of this procession on April 19th, 1865, the African American fraternal organizations marched. They were taking up the rear of the procession there. And I am certain that the Colored Union marched. I think they carried a sign, in fact, that said, "We mourn our loss." But at the head of the line was Charles H. Shorter. He was a future association member and the son of existing association members. Shorter and his 22nd U.S. Colored Infantry had just arrived by boat at the Southwest Wharf after an overnight trip from City Point, Virginia. They jogged up 4.5th Street to Pennsylvania Avenue, and there they halted between 6th and 7th. Their guns were pointed down, which is military style for funerals. As the broad stream of mourners approached from the direction of the White House up Pennsylvania Avenue, Shorter and his comrades were ordered into place at the front of the procession. Military bands struck up a dirge, and the white troops fell in behind. The 22nd Colored Infantry led the way to the Capitol. So it was a step into the Reconstruction era in Washington. In 1869, the association appointed a man named Gordon Snowden to search for a new burial ground. And they found 7 acres that were for sale for $2,500 by the heirs of John Quincy Adams. This land abutted a small Quaker cemetery. In April 1870, Charles Francis Adams, John Quincy's son, signed over the deed to the association. I'm pretty sure that member Isaac Clarke probably thought about that day 27 years earlier when he had gotten money from John Quincy Adams to help pay for his freedom. So the grave sites cost about $10 each, and a rotating group of 5 trustees sold plots and got 10% of the take. Most of the money was spent moving graves from the old cemetery at 12th and V to the new ground, and also on improving the new cemetery. In 1875, Gordon Snowden negotiated the sale of the old ground for $15,000 for a new children's hospital. I think a lot of us can remember when Children's Hospital was there. The association gave Gurdon Snowden a silver tea set in appreciation for that $15,000 sale. What did the cemetery look like? And there's a lot of points on here, but I can tell you that what this says is that it was fenced with white wooden boards, an entry gate stood at the Adams Mill roadside, and a cobblestone path led through the ground. There was a caretaker's cottage that they acquired secondhand from Franklin Park, a tool shed, and a brick burial vault. The association even paved Adams Mill Road, leading from Columbia Road to the front gate. There were some stone markers, but many graves had wooden headboards with painted messages. Mounds of earth over the graves were decorated with shells and broken ceramics and glass and objects associated to the deceased. Children's graves were covered with toys. There were large funerals and small. John H. Brooks, the leader of the Fifth Baptist Church, today Vermont Avenue Baptist Church, was buried there in 1884, and 30 horse-drawn carriages and thousands of mourners on foot accompanied him from the church to the cemetery. Who was buried there? We documented 8,428 burials. 57% were under the age of 5. Of the nearly 3,000 adults, 12% were born in the district, 20% came from Maryland, and 60% came from Virginia. The rest were from other states and countries. So in the 1880s, the cemetery operated at its peak, having between 400 and 600 burials a year. And the stories of the buried, and this is really what I like to investigate, are those of everyday people who lived in historic times. Barbara Bates, your member, and I worked very hard to find the soldiers and sailors and scouts and spies, and we found 45 of them documented. I think there's probably 4 or 5 times that many that we can't document because they didn't get pensions. A woman who worked as a servant in Mary Surratt's boarding house, who's buried there, she provided important information to the Lincoln assassination investigators. A blacksmith from South Carolina, we discovered recently when a descendant contacted us, had actually been a Republican legislator back in his home state. Many came here, though, with little more than the clothes on their backs, but they came as self-emancipated men, women, and children, ready to begin free lives. And if you think about it, being buried in the place of one's choosing might have been for some a newfound right. In 1889, association members were taken by surprise. They were asked by the men scouting land for a new national zoo how much it would cost to buy the cemetery. William Hornaday, a Smithsonian taxidermist, thought it would make a great spot for a buffalo herd. And his notebook is in the Smithsonian archives. So this really caught them off guard.
What year is that again?
1889, with several hundred burials a year taking place. On April 24th, 1889, a special meeting was held at the home of member James Wright. President Isaac Clarke called the meeting to order, and Sandy Alexander, a famous Baptist minister, led the prayer. According to the minutes, which are in the National Archives, the meeting had been called to consider a communication from the Zoological Park asking that the association furnish them with a written statement of the lowest price at which they will agree to sell the Young Men's Colored Baptist Cemetery. The zoo gave it a new name. They didn't understand that it was called Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery. They called it the Young Men's Colored Baptist Cemetery. They sort of threw everything in there. Brother Charles H. Shorter, they called one another brother in their meetings. Brother Charles H. Shorter moved that no answer be returned. A long while having been spent in talking over the matter, a patient hearing given each speaker, and no confusion prevailing at any time, the question was put on the motion that no answer be returned to the communication from the commissioners, and that motion passed 10-3. They held fast. They refused repeated requests by the zoo to name a price, but eventually an end run was executed by cemetery neighbors. It was led by Smithsonian scientist G. Brown Good, also a neighbor, and as it turns out, William Hornaday's boss. The neighbors successfully petitioned the city to close Mount Pleasant Plains and also the Quaker burial ground due to health concerns. There would be no further burials after June 1890. So the zoo acquired 1.6 acres of the cemetery by eminent domain. I'm not going to spend much time in this era, the 1900s, but the northward expansion of the city brought new pressures on the land. Association members had voted in 1890 to suspend all their benefits, and they too were dying off. So in 1913, Charles H. Shorter, the last living trustee, asked the DC Supreme Court to order that the graves be exhumed and reinterred elsewhere. He asked the court to appoint trustees to sell the land, and he asked the court to decree how the profits should be shared. Although Shorter died in 1916, the court granted his request in 1923. Congress dissolved the charter it had given the Colored Union Benevolent Association, and it called for the graves to be moved to a suitable place. So the land was sold off in chunks. About 1.9 acres of the land went to the federal government on the cemetery's west hillside and became part of the Rock Creek and Potomac Parkway. Of the approximately 4 acres that were left, it had to be cleared of graves. So in 1939, the city health inspector dug 390 exploratory openings and found only 129 sets of full and partial remains, along with 13 headstones. And those remains were reinterred in a mass grave at Woodlawn Cemetery. Developers, once the land was cleared, bought the property in 1940. The war intervened shortly thereafter. In 1959, the developers finally began excavating to build 4 large apartment buildings with underground parking. They unearthed an unknown number of graves. Neighborhood kids collected bones from the site. After a concerned neighbor called the city, health inspectors were sent in to observe as more remains were removed by steam shovel and trucked to the morgue. 14 sets of remains were accessioned by the Smithsonian. No apartment buildings were ever built. And the vacant lot by the 1970s had become a people's park. Neighborhood activist Walter C. Pierce, whom people in this room remember, and others persuaded Congress to buy the land for a badly needed park. Prior to construction, an archaeological survey was conducted, and they found nothing left. So when the park was built, massive amounts of earth were moved in the building of the park. It was a destructive process, even though it was in the name of a park. Large amounts of earth were moved to level the ball field. A large stone wall was inserted along the ball field, and other park features caused more changes to the site's contours. So if we could go to the next slide, just getting to the final portion of my talk. And this is what we all have to sort of wonder about. When does a cemetery stop being a cemetery? In the summer of 2005, my neighbor Eddie Becker called me to come see several deep tarp-covered pits and a bobcat excavator at Walter Pierce Park. It was upsetting because Eddie and I knew the history of the site. We called our council member Jim Graham to find out why a bobcat was being used in a known graveyard. In fact, we learned it was an archaeological dig intended to clear the way for a major construction project. The city wanted to build large terraces with very deep footings on the north hillside of the park for community gardening. Well, I can tell you city officials weren't happy when we started beating the drum about their likely desecration of a black cemetery. I called Howard University and by a stroke of luck got through to Mark Mack. Mark was a biological anthropologist who just completed a decade's worth of work at the African Burial Ground in Lower Manhattan. And when I told him about the situation at Walter Pierce, he said yes, he would help. He didn't hesitate. We then engaged in a 9-month argument with the city. We wanted permission to conduct a non-invasive archaeological survey of the park. We would pay for it with private grants and donations, we said. City officials claimed that all the graves had been removed, even though no one seemed to know how many people had been buried there in the first place. A historical fact we uncovered helped push the garden terracing project off its rails. We showed city officials an 1889 news report about the cemetery's closure, which stated that at least 6,700 people had been buried there. This wasn't some rural wayside burial ground. So, this is Mark Mack on the left, Ike Masumbi, and Miesha Hayward, two of the students in the earliest phase of the archaeological project. We got our way. And as I said, we were first funded with private donations and grants that were made to the Kalorama Citizens Association. And in 2010, the City Council approved additional funding. So I'd just like to go through a few slides here that shows you a few things we found during the survey. These were the only 2 intact headstones we found. You can see how almost invisible they were. And the ground at Walter Pierce shifts a lot. You know, you get a lot of vegetation and moving earth. And just one day, one of the keen-eyed archaeological team members was standing on the hillside. I was there that day. He said, "Bingo!" And it was shocking because we'd been at the site already for 3 years. So the kids, I call them kids, they're all grown and gone now, lifted up the markers, and we didn't find any inscriptions. So the next slide. These are the sorts of things you don't know they're significant, but they are. Broken ceramics, broken glassware. In this case, you probably don't see it, and it's very hard, even if you were there in person, to see skeletal remains. It's a jawbone. Bricks from old grave sites. Can we go to the next slide? Sometimes the finds were very obvious, like this coffin handle. And that's a catalog from the 1879 catalog that allows you to buy coffin handles if you're in that business. So some finds were obvious. Can we go to the next slide? And some weren't. These are also coffin hardware, things that were put over nails. These were decorative graves. These weren't plain boxes. These were serious coffins. So again, you can see how almost invisible these sorts of finds were. And the Howard team was just great at finding things. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Can you see that? The things he's holding up in his hands there on the side, they're hollow. So we assume this was either a candle holder or maybe an incense burner. It was some sort of ceremonial object, possibly, that was used as an altar, possibly for graveside ceremonies. We don't know. So let's go to the next slide, and then I'm almost ready to sum up. Let me first of all say that this was not a dig. It was a survey of the surface of the park. There wasn't any digging because the point was to protect graves, not disturb them. Mark Mack had witnessed the angry debates surrounding the African Burial Ground project in New York, when federal contractors dug up more than 400 black graves to build an office building. He was on the front line of a major shift in anthropological thinking that descendants should lead decision-making in the treatment of ancestral graves. Mark repeatedly said that the project's first clients, our archaeological project's first clients, were the buried. The second were their descendants. And third in line were the rest of us. My role in the project was public outreach. I used to be a reporter. But one of the weirdest things I ever had to do was transport to Mark's lab at Howard a plastic container full of bones that a nonprofit group had found during park cleanups. So I did what any clear-minded person would do. Put the box of bones in the passenger seat and seat belted them in. I turned up Neil Young full blast on the CD. And I prayed to God that I wouldn't be pulled over. So my other role was as a lead historian on the project. And so we can go to the next slide. This person looks familiar. It's Barbara Bates, and a brilliant student named Shayla Monroe from Howard. Barbara and I worked with Howard students at the DC Archives to find out who was buried at the cemetery. I always felt that if we could put flesh on those bones, almost literally, that would be an important thing to investigate if we could do it. And there, by the way, there is no burial book unless somebody in this room has it in an attic somewhere. There was no book of interments that we were ever able to find. So we hand-searched 75,000 death certificates for the period of time that the cemetery existed. And we culled out the 8,428 names. And those are online at walterpierceparkcemeteries.org. If you're looking for ancestors who were buried during the time of the cemetery's existence, you might find them there. This is the database. That's why Barbara was adjusting her glasses. We were really copying down names, addresses, where folks died, cause of death, age. Sometimes the death certificates would tell you how long the people had been in DC. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Mark Mack died in a car accident in 2012, and he was only 50 years old. His colleague from the African Burial Ground Project was a woman, Rachel Watkins. She's a biological anthropologist at American University, and she stepped forward to help. I had conducted interviews with Mark throughout the project, and I used those interviews to write the archaeological report while leaning heavily on the scientific expertise of Dr. Watkins, students Justin Donovan and Shayla Monroe, and Howard anthropologist Eleanor King, who was also a colleague of Mark's. The survey found ample evidence of the cemeteries, exposed remains, coffin hardware, gravestones, and grave objects. In 2013, ground-penetrating radar was performed at the site, and dozens of intact graves were detected, even though this site has been the site of major disruptions throughout the 1900s. A geophysical analysis of the contour changes at the site suggested that hundreds or even thousands more graves might still exist 30 feet below the surface, too deep to be detected. The intact graves, by the way, were where the city wanted to build the garden terraces. So from the start, the point of our work was to protect the cemeteries. We angered some people, and we baffled others. On balance, I think we probably made more friends than enemies. So let's go to the next slide, which is just a feel-good slide. Here's some of the friends. Patricia Tyson and the Amazing Ladies of Freed. Mark Mack giving a tour to Washington Quakers. The Marie Reed School cadets. And then community members who gather each spring to say aloud the names of the buried and tell their stories. And this is a tradition we began once we documented the names. Each person reads from a separate list. Every few names, there's a one-sentence story about them. And with 40 people reading aloud simultaneously, we say all 8,400 names in about a half hour. And it's pretty trippy, I can tell you. Giving away my 60s roots. Slide 30, this is the last slide. Okay, last Saturday, descendants dedicated 4 National Underground Railroad markers at the Calvert Street entrance to Walter Pierce Park. Dr. Yonther Mills of Asbury United Methodist gave the invocation. And you'll remember that Asbury was founded by association members, and it was where they met every month. 11th and K, still there. Mara Cherkowski and I wrote the signs, and the signs were paid for with a grant from the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. We had additional funding and support from Rock Creek Park. These are the first permanent markers at the site. They're not on city land, they're on National Park Service land. City, are you listening? 17 years ago, when the Walter Pierce Archaeology Project began, it seemed like Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery had ended the way so many other black cemeteries had, and that was with disruption, desecration, and disappearance. The small Quaker Cemetery was ruined too in the black cemetery's wake. Last Saturday's dedication gave me hope that our work at the park has changed the story's ending a little, or at least added an epilogue. I hope the cemeteries now can also tell a story of endurance, continuity, and reconnection. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary. This is fascinating. I think we can all agree it was met and exceeded our expectations. And we, first of all, I'd like to recognize the fact that we have had 20 to 26 participants online. Thanks to Cindy Gwelly. Welcome. Welcome, members. Come and visit us in person when you can and when you feel comfortable. So I think we have time for some questions. So, Mary?
Yes.
Be sure to say your name.
Oh, for the record, I am Marcy Cohen. My question is, last month we had Frank Smith, the head of the African American Civil War Museum and Monument. Have you been able to cross-reference his list of soldiers that may have been, who died and may also have been buried at Pierce Park?
Needless to say, Frank is not only one of the people who was a community activist that helped create Walter Pierce Park, but he's a good friend. And we try to work from records where we're sure that the person is the same when we identified these 45 soldiers, sailors, scouts, and spies. And for that, you almost have to have pension records because so many names are common names, like, you know, Chuck Brown or Frank Smith, yeah. So the 45 we've documented, their names are on the wall that Frank created, but we don't use his records necessarily. We try to go to the pension records at the archives when we can. So, thank you.
Back here.
Hi, I'm Vicki Crawford, and I have a two-part question. Number one, Asbury United Methodist Church. There's also one in Gaithersburg. It's a retirement home. Are they related?
I don't know much about Methodism, but
Okay, that's
Asbury
not
was one of
important.
the founders of the church, so it pops up a lot throughout the country.
Yeah, I was just
So
curious.
I don't think there's a connection, but I might be wrong.
Okay, my other question is, with today's technology, with the bones that have been recovered, have any of them ever gone through DNA testing to possibly find out who these people are?
Except for the bones that were picked up at the site by volunteers that I had to drive over to Howard. We left everything on site as much as we could. And part of the new anthropological thinking is that you don't mess with graves. So no, we've never done testing on the bones that were at the lab. I know that, you know, those questions have also arisen in connection with the African burial ground in New York, and I think they did do some DNA testing on that, so.
Hi, I'm Andrea Seeger. Where are the documents and the artifacts that you found? Are they viewable or accessible by us or anybody who wants to do any kind of research?
This was all original research that forms the basis for my talk. I worked from court records at the National Archives to tell you about the association, because when the land was divvied up and proceeds were, you know, allotted to the heirs of the cemetery trustees, all those became the subject of court cases. So there's a pretty big file of things at the National Archives. I'm not sure if the archives is open in person right yet, but I would recommend that you, if you want to start learning about it and figuring out your own research paths, go to our Walter Pierce Park Cemeteries.org website, and you'll see all our reports online. The archaeological report, the ground penetrating radar report, as well as the database that Barbara and I and the students compiled that has the 8,000 names with it. If you're doing genealogical research or African American research, it can be really helpful too. But you know, National Archives records and just those reports that we've put online, as far as I know, there, you know, you see a lot of history that gets repeated by people from time to time, and it's not necessarily accurate or original. I think this is pretty accurate, and I know it's original. So.
Nelson?
Yes. Okay. Yeah,
can
the
tell.
15th Street Presbyterian Church is mentioned here. On Juneteenth, 1855, a biracial group, met at this church and established the Republican Party of the District of Columbia. Several names on here I recognize were at that meeting. Juneteenth, 1855.
I would love to know what you know about that.
You will. You will.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
Tom?
From
Tom, we have a few questions from online. Can I read them to you?
oh, yes, please. Cindy? Thanks to
Terrific.
Cindy
What-
Boyd for arranging the online meeting today.
Hi. The first question is about Woodlawn Cemetery. And they're asking if that is in the same kind of historic trouble that you saw in this cemetery, because he does, this member has a great grandfather and grand uncle that are buried there.
I don't want to pretend to be an expert about Woodlawn. I know there are folks working over there. Tyrone General is one of them. I don't know whether Woodlawn was ever subject to development pressures or not, but I know it's fairly rugged, and I know that people have been working for years to try to bring it into shape. But maybe Hayden has an answer.
Here, Hayden. Thank you. Hayden Wetzel. I used to work as a volunteer at Woodlawn. Of course, all the bodies are there. It's not the same case as Pierce, where things have been dug up and taken around and so forth. All of the burial records exist, and they say where people were buried, but the problem, of course, is that the whole place is so overgrown that it would probably be impossible to find a specific site. And the areas that have been cleared in Woodlawn, over time, periodically somebody gets the idea they're going to clear it and try to make it look like Arlington Cemetery. There are virtually no headstones. Just in the very front. You go in and you see the headstones, like, ooh, maybe there's a whole lot more, and there aren't.
But I've got a follow-up question that maybe you can answer as well, because the follow-up question is if the records of Woodlawn note who was moved to Woodlawn from Mount Pleasant Plains.
No, when the exploratory openings were made in 1939 and the 129 sets of remains were moved, the health inspector didn't have records of who was being found. And so the names would not be on the Woodlawn records of the people who were reburied in the mass grave at Woodlawn.
We have
Did Cindy have any more online questions?
Not that I see. I think we're good to go. Back to you.
Okay, well, we've got one here.
Hi, I'm Angela Dickey, I was wondering what methods you use to find the descendants of the people buried there. If you had 8,000 people buried there, did you have a whole team of genealogists looking for their descendants?
No, would you like to start one?
No, but you seem to indicate you did find some. I'm running a separate project for where I'm looking for descendants, and it's very difficult. So I'm very interested in your process.
The cemetery at Walter Pierce itself was physically invisible. So the first thing we had to do was remind people that this was a cemetery. And then once we found the names, we put them online immediately, because one of the many ethical lessons that Mark beat into my head was that we had to keep this public. We had to keep the information going out. And so sometimes people find their ancestors on our database because they're doing an internet search. And then they make themselves known to me. I'm sure there are dozens of people who never contact me, or maybe hundreds. Some of the descendants have shown up by accident on walking tours and discovered their ancestors are under their feet where they're walking. And sometimes in the case of the many, many Edmondson descendants that we've met and who were at Saturday's dedication event, they came by way of Mary Kay Rick's book to me, The Fugitives of the Pearl, because she really did a good job gathering up those descendants' memories for her book. So I wish it were systematic, but you know how that goes. Are you working on the 272 project, or?
I'm working on the Dacor Bacon House project, the historic house at 18 and F Street, 1801 F Street, which was built by enslaved people. And we now have about 40 first names of enslaved people and a couple of last names. But we're going to try to figure out who their descendants might be. I wonder if any of those people could be buried in that cemetery.
Well, look online.
Yeah, okay,
The
we
other
will.
thing, I think every high school, I wish every high school had a book that lists all the people emancipated in 1863. We have that book by Dorothy Provine that lists, 1862. And we have 2 books of freedom certificates for Washington, D.C. that Dorothy Provine wrote. And I wish every high school had those books, because you can sometimes nail down owners and enslaved people in the freedom certificates or in the emancipation papers. Yeah.
Okay, I think that, would you like to?
With your permission, after
Well, let me start with presenting Mary with our highly coveted Certificate of Appreciation from the Association of Oldest Inhabitants of the District of Columbia. Thank you so much for this really, a lot of us knew a little about this, but you have filled in the gaps in an extraordinarily understandable and informative way. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Keep up the great work.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Very welcome. Thanks again. Julie Hubbard has,
I have a fundraising opportunity for AOI.
well, come and present it.
I'm sorry, this just came up at lunch, this idea. I'm Judy Hubbard. I'm an active member here at the Women's National Democratic Club, a member of AOI, and like all of us, am interested in history. And like one of the gender selections here, women's history is not well known at all. And so I was just asked, the Educational Foundation of the Women's National Democratic Club have produced a planner, 1922 planner, which is called Women Organize. And there's all kinds of information about women's history, unknown women's history. And it's a great opportunity to not only learn women's history, keep track of your appointments, and also, to me, journal about this extraordinary year that we're going to go through, another extraordinary year. And I was asked, they're $20, and that if you buy one of our planners today, $10 will go to AOI.
Terrific, wonderful. Thank you.
So, yes, I'm sorry, I
quite
wasn't,
all right.
it just came up at lunch, and they're available by the front door. I urge you to look at it and hopefully buy one of the planners. It's a unique gift. It's absolutely a unique gift, and I encourage all of us to really document what's going to happen in 2022. It's going to be another extraordinary year, as we all know, because I think we'll look back at this planner in 10 years, hopefully those of us or give it to your relatives and say, that couldn't have happened. Well, it did. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Judy. I have a comment or a question over here.
I have some art at home by Mary Belcher. Is this the same Mary Belcher?
Yes, Mary is an artist. I should have mentioned that. This has awakened all sorts of interest for me personally. Among other things, it will inspire me to get a hold of my colleague Gary Shorter, who was a friend, also a mutual friend with Mary and Barbara's, and say, "Time to renew your membership, pal." We just looked at the historic role of your family in the cemetery, and the other point is that sometimes there are places around Washington where this sort of forgetfulness goes on. From my own experience, for those of you who know, far northwest, there's a section of Chainbridge Road between Loughborough and MacArthur Boulevard that still looks like a country lane. And there is, in the middle of that somewhere, there's an abandoned cemetery. It's not abandoned? Okay, tell me about it. It's if you can, in 5 words.
Well, there's a caretaker. I don't know all that much about it. It's hard to get in. And I don't know if that burials continue to occur.
Go ahead. Here's the mic. Go ahead.
It's an intact cemetery. Yeah. It's an intact cemetery, and it's part of no, that's a different one. No, it's a chain bridge. There was an African American community there.
That I'm aware of, yes. Mhm.
Right, on that hill between.
And there is, what is
Loughborough
a,
and Chainbridge Road and MacArthur and, what's that? I guess Loughborough, anyway. And it's sort of, they were kind of bought out by. Oh, okay. It died by attrition, and, you know, developers made people offers they couldn't refuse and that type of thing. But the cemetery's there, and there's a building that was a school.
right, I remember the building also. It kind of disappears. I go by sometimes and I can't find it, and I think it's Brigadoon. And then other times I can find it.
It's condos or something like that. I mean, it's
And the rate of development in that part of the city where people are putting up mega mansions, you feel terror that somebody's going to acquire that.
The cemetery, when I was there last, was being taken care of by a family that lived next door. The school you're thinking of is the Military Road School. No, not military. The Chainbridge Road School. I think it's a private residence.
Thank you. This is the sort of memories that having a wonderful presentation like Mary's. Now, also, we do have new members. Carolyn gave me the list. I don't know. I misplaced it among my papers. Do you have a copy, Carolyn, or would you like to come up and read the names of the new members, or standing in place, do it? Thank you, Rick.
Well, our new members as of the November meeting, Carol Keene, who's also a Wilson alum with me, an AU alum, and her godfather was a past member and treasurer of the AOI. One of my predecessors. Yep.
Welcome.
Carol also is a fifth-generation Washingtonian, graphic designer. She designed some of the DC Heritage Trail signs.
And the Nina School renovation, and recently the Lafayette Pointer Park. The Lafayette Pointer Park that was just renamed up in Ward 3. I think we do this. But yes, my father grew up on Newport, and my mother lived on Highland West.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Martha Mitchell, who was just here and had to leave, so we miss her. She's lived and worked in DC for over 20 years, and was invited by me. Jean Stewart. She's lived and worked in DC for over 20 years, retired civil servant, not a DC native, but member of many DC civic organizations. And invited by Pat Bitondo and Barbara Bates. And Judith Ordvos. She's been lived in DC for over 20 years, is a medical writer, editor, and invited by Winifred Swanson. Is she here? She's not here. And those are the 4 new members, 5 new members since our November meeting.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Carolyn, and welcome to our new members. And I hope that will be, that and our terrific talk today will be an incentive to all of us to go out to talk to our neighbors and ask them to join this terrific organization, excellent organization. Before we adjourn, just a reminder that on New Year's Day, January 1st, the ancient Washington custom of gathering for a New Year's Day reception, except now in the modern sense we call it a brunch, but we will be having the New Year's Day traditional AOI of DC New Year's Day brunch here at the Women's National Democratic Club on Saturday, January 1st, New Year's Day. Is that 11 or 11:30 we begin? 11 o'clock. So get your RSVPs in and join us for what will be, I'm sure, a really enjoyable holiday event with your fellow members. Thank you all for coming. Thanks again for helping make this second meeting at the Women's National Democratic Club another great success. And thank you to Dr. Cindy Gwelly and also to the more than 20 people who joined us online. We're very happy to have you in this modern era. It's important to have everybody involved, whether both here in person or online. So thanks again, and thanks for coming.